Welcome to a new series I want to do on the channel for RPG material, which is talking about great designers of RPG adventures, particularly Dungeons and Dragons adventures. I think D&D, and I may do other games, but D&D is particularly easy to talk about adventure design in because of the relative definitiveness of sort of scenario objectives based on the tradition that D&D is developed out of and the sub-traditions within it, because of the sheer volume of D&D material, and also in part I think because there is a palpable distinction between the kind of volume of work that certain D&D designers have produced compared to designers elsewhere. There are some other games that I think are interesting, but not many people wrote many adventures for World of Darkness games, and a lot of them were very bad. So to say, it's very hard to say, let's look at the corpus of work of a World of Darkness designer. But for Dungeons and Dragons, I think there are many designers that we can look at and say, look, this is a really interesting designer. These are things that distinguish their work, that sort of thing. And I'm going to talk today. It's good to start off a series with a bang, isn't it? The obvious one would be to say, let's talk Gary Gygax, who by many measures must be the best D&D designer ever. But I'm actually going to talk about the one person I think can rival Gary Gygax, which is someone called Bruce Cordell. He designed chiefly the majority of his adventures during 2nd edition, and he's grossly neglected, I think, as a result. Interestingly, I think before we kind of continue into the main discussion of his design stuff, I think it's maybe worth saying, what background did he come into D&D against? 1996 is his first product, Gates of Firestorm Peak, which we'll talk about. And 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, I think there are lots of good things about. It's at this point one of the forgotten stepchild in some respects. I mean, maybe 4th edition now is 4th edition having been somewhat memory hold, but I think 2nd edition is seen by old schoolers as degenerate and late and bad, and by any new schooler as it's not old enough to be pure. So there's a kind of weird late or too late too early thing, and there's a lot of things you can critique about it. I think there's lots of good stuff about it. I think for settings there's some amazing settings. I think mechanically there's some really interesting explorations and options. The proliferation of options actually tends towards the idea of distinction of function in character, like kits I'm thinking about here, and that's good. But adventure design is not a strong area for 2nd edition. So look, 1st edition of Dungeons and Dragons comes out in 1978, the Player's Handbook does. By that point, the modules that really we think of as 1st edition modules are already coming out. And then you also have Basic come out around the same time, and you have the Basic modules, B and X, and the rest of them come out. And so you've got these two streams from 77 onwards through to the early 80s, where you're talking literally dozens of modules which people look back on now as the core canon of Dungeons and Dragons adventure design, along with a few third-party products from Judges Guild, particularly City State of the Invincible Overlord and Dark Tower and the Caverns of Thracia, also from Judges Guild. So that's the sort of the canon. And you're talking so many modules people love. They're like, oh, I really liked the L series, Bone Hill, that's a great one. Someone else might say, well, whatever you say about Tracy Hickman, Ravenloft, really interesting module. Even so, and that's 83, I think, possibly. So you're talking about 6 years there from just before 1st edition drops and when Basic drops to kind of the point where many people see there as being a shift in philosophy. And those adventures, there's so many good ones, people love them, they are the canon. 2nd edition, how many 2nd edition modules can you name as being part of the canon that people really see as integral to the D&D experience in terms of this was a great adventure or this massively advanced things? Mostly in the old school kind of sphere, we'll actually talk about newer stuff, really, and say, these were the big early OSR hits, this is where it developed, this is the current state of the art. But 2nd edition is a black hole. And I think Cordell is a reason we should dive into that black hole, as dangerous as it sounds. There are highlights in the 1989 to 2000 period. I think Ed Greenwood actually published a lot of really interesting stuff, both during 1st edition and then mostly during 2nd edition. I think S5, Dancing Hut of Baba Yaga, that's a great module. I think the Al-Qadim modules were great. I think Planescape had a couple of very good modules. Spelljammer even did too. But we're talking about very few of them which are all-time greats or classics, or which are really summaries of what is canonical or what is being added to the canon of D&D. Cordell is different. Cordell from 1996 to 1998 chiefly, publishes a number of modules which are a large enough body of work to be considered as a great designer's work. Not one good module, but many, 8 in particular. He publishes things which advance and develop the canon. They don't blow it up, they don't ignore it, but they iterate and develop and add new elements into the gumbo. And there is an intensity of excellence in those works, which is top tier, and which is better than, say, Ed Greenwood, who I've just praised, better than anything Ed Greenwood wrote. You know, the achievement and perfection in each is better. Now, he actually wrote a lot of second edition books, and he also wrote a lot of third and fourth edition books. And I think lots of people who are into D&D might think of him really as, I think, one of the lead designers on fourth edition, which, very, as I say, the other forgotten stepchild, and then a very important person in third edition. He wrote the first modules for each of third and fourth edition. The third edition module, Sunless Citadel, is interesting, worth looking at. It has some linear points, but it also has some really creative factional things going on. It has the now really quite archetypal and iconic cute kobold who becomes your friend option, and factional stuff to do with kobolds and goblins. And then it introduces the Gulthias tree and turns kind of the needlemen, well, actually it's twig blights to begin with, needlemen join them later, but the twig creatures into the evil offspring of the Gulthias tree, which is a vampiric evil tree. For fourth edition, he wrote Keep on the Shadowfell as well as a couple of others. And I really love, by the way, this particular format of adventure booklet. I actually think it was a really interesting step in fourth. Keep on the Shadowfell is an interesting module. It has interesting things about it, but it shows the kind of development of the game into fourth edition with very linear maps, interesting encounters, but chiefly sort of set up to be a tactical miniatures game. And I think you can see by then certainly he has lost his muse. Latterly, he was involved heavily in the second edition of Numenera, and he has written modules both for his own stuff there and I think for Numenera as well, and for other systems around that, and working with Monty Cook. And Monty Cook's an interesting designer in good and bad ways in his own right. But there is, I think, a sign of a return to something interesting via the step into Numenera, which is a fascinating system. But really, to get Cordell, we have to go back to this period, 96 to 2000, particularly 96 to 98, where he is writing for second edition. And second edition, I've already said, we see as perhaps seen as decadent and over-lush, many people would say, with mechanical options, even if that's also a strength. There's so many things, so many settings, so many ideas. There's just such a heavy publication schedule. This is part of TSR's problem. They can't sell stuff. They're overprinting, they're overstoring. And so into that, where there's a few good designers, but really the money, the effort is going into setting boxes and player-facing products, is some of the kind of most obvious stuff that's being developed and put out there. Into that comes this guy, Bruce Cordell, who's quite young at the time. He's in his 20s, and he just starts publishing modules which are really comfortably the best on the whole second edition modules that come out. You know, maybe as Night Below, Dancing Out to Baba Yaga are the ones that really challenge that. I might think of one or two more. And the first of those is, we'll start here. Actually, I'll say there are a few that I'm not going to cover here or talk in any detail. Reverse Dungeon, Die Vecna Die, and Return to White Plume Mountain. All three, I think, 99 and 2000. Die Vecna Die is the final adventure for second edition, and is a kind of exploration of how the universe changes to become third edition of D&D. And Die Vecna Die is interesting. It's planes hopping. It goes to different places. It really mashes up canon ideas. It's controversial. It is Cordellian in its explosivity of enormous, ridiculous things going on. There are co-writers on it as well. Reverse Dungeon, interesting gimmick. What if you're the bad guy? What if people... So basically like the mini card game boss monster. And Return to White Plume Mountain, again, he is one of the contributors on. He's basically the manuscript writer. He gets ideas for plot from some people who Wizards by that point pay. He turns it into adventure. It's then edited again by Roger Moore. So how much he had to do with it, who knows? But it has some interesting stuff. It's probably one of the least interesting of the things he wrote. At least that's my current view. I also won't address the source books. He wrote lots of source books. The Planescape Guide to the Ethereal Plane, The Ithiliad, the Guide to Illithids, some interesting stuff in there. So same with Ethereal Plane, that's very good. Bastion of Faith, College of Wizardry, Dungeon Builder's Handbook. All of them have things to say for them, but I'm not going to deal with that here. But we'll start with his first second edition product, and therefore his first adventure, Gates of Firestorm Peak. This is a big boy. This actually, I say about the fourth edition product, this actually uses the same format, doesn't it? I don't think I'd remembered that. Gates of Firestorm Peak is a really interesting product. It's his first one. It's a big one. It's technically setting neutral, but there are things which connect it to later works of his. He creates the shared universe from the start, if you like, and he starts seeding stuff. It's meant to highlight the combat options, particularly from 2.5, the Player's Options series of books. And it kind of does that. And, there are things where it's particularly setting up big battles and giving rules explanations for things where it's like, oh yeah, you should, this particular thing interacts with these new rules in this way. But the big thing is just, it's a crazy adventure about going into a mountain where there are lots of factions and weird things, and it's basically discovering a gate to the Far Realm, to the Lovecraftian Far Realm, and just kind of throwing ideas and having them stick more often than not, and just layering on weirdness. I think conceptual density is a big thing for Cordell. The idea that really just you stick one more thing on top. What if it's this, but this, also this, and then you smash them together? And in here, it's like, what if there was a mountain that you need to go to and clear out or do something with? Oh, and what if there's a Duergar city in there? But what if there was also like weird mutants in caves as you got further in? Because it turned out this was all just a cover for a mage who has some strange experiments going on. But what if there were like good myconids in amongst the mutants? And what if there's a living wall of the adventurers you might find? Like those just ideas and vignettes being layered on top of each other, so that the overall view is the going from an interesting concept, the Duergar city, rather than just a normal let's go to a mountain and do something, but then adding on the whole, but actually there's these radioactive caverns, but actually there's all kinds of interesting things within that. And then finally there's this gate to the Far Realm. And I think it's not as if Cordell is the first person to like Lovecraft or bring Lovecraft and other weird fiction writers in. Gary Gygax is the other really obvious candidate for that, from G1 and then into WG4 particularly. But I think here you see something where, though I don't think this is his most successful work, it is one of his bigger adventures. It's something where there's just a constant willingness to lean into the decadence, to lean into the mechanical enormities of second edition, rather than saying, ooh, how do we take one concept and do something, or how do we how do you think for this setting, or I've got this scenario idea. It's more a kind of like everything at once against the wall, and it works so well. There are issues, and I'm not going to repeat this as I give the overview of his work, but there are issues in his second edition books, as in every other second edition book, where just things are unreadably dense. By unreadably, I mean you have to highlight them. You have to read them twice and highlight them. The keys, you're talking about, I should say, it's not as if Gary always got beyond 2 rooms in a page, or 3 rooms in a page, but the fact that 1 to 4 rooms is the entire range here, usually 2 rooms a page, with much wider setting. One thing is it's double column. It does mean that there's just more page count. It's harder to flick through to find information. That is not unique to Bruce Cordell, but he is certainly as much of an overwriter as anybody else in the era. It is, however, a very promising start, and I think the early elements of Lovecraftianness, of throwing everything at the wall, of layering on concepts and putting vignettes across a concept, if you know what I mean, to texture it, to realise it, rather than just hoping the players get it. Also in that case, there's a pretty interesting map with some decent loops in both the radioactive caverns and in the Duergar city, where you end up, that's nothing, there's just a variety of things you do. Duergar city, oh well, you got to sneak around, hope maybe infiltrate a bit. Oh wait, now you're just fighting loads of Duergar. Mass combat, or semi-mass combat, using the player's option stuff. Then you're doing a very different thing, exploring these radioactive caves, potentially going mad. I even forgot to mention that he adds in mechanics for insanity. He basically goes and reads Call of Cthulhu and goes, yep, here we go. let's have some characters going insane in this. And I think that's all pretty indicative of what's to come. I'll talk next about let's talk briefly about the Shattered Circle. In a way, this almost deserves talking about more. This is more or less the only generic level 1 adventure published for 2nd edition in a separate release rather than in Dungeon that I can think of. There must be others, but it's pretty much the only one using the black and red generic livery of the mid-90s. From time out of mind, the standing stones known as the Circle of Cahavaniel have stood lonely vigil on a grassy hilltop. Shepherders once moved their flocks over the hill and through the circles, sometimes resting in the cool shadows cast by the ancient stones. Everything changed when a stone finger fell, revealing a fissure in the earth. Now dark shadows caress the circle after the sun sets. Creatures out of nightmare dance upon the hillsides at night. Many swear a unicorn of deepest ebony now hunts all upon 2 legs who draw near, while stunted creatures scurry in the shadows, abducting sheep from their sheds and drawing them below ground for good. After the disappearance of a shepherd, fear grows stronger in neighbouring villages. Who will brave the black hollow of the ancient circle of Cahavaniel? Heroes of stern metal must descend into the cavity and explore the ancient existing spaces there. It says, accomplished players with new characters will find this adventure fun and challenging, but it can also serve as a beginner's first taste of the AD&D game. Very much intentionally set in that way. Pretty good art as well on the front. Very atmospheric blurb. You get the feeling there, don't you, of more things man was not meant to know. Decent maps. There actually are, again, in an edition where you more or less give up on looping, there are a couple of interesting maps with actual loops in them and secret entrances and multiple entrances in some cases. But the thing here, I guess I'd say, is that it's simple, it's short, it is a kind of low-level adventure, but and some of it, standing stones, that's not itself particularly exciting, I suppose. But what is interesting is the degree to which he just throws kind of very fresh and sometimes kind of weird things in to say, okay, the low-level adventure, what do you do with it? They're spider people. Some dark artifact is driving them all mad. There's a large named catfish and a deep gnome mate who you can rescue and he'll join you. That sort of classic mixture of weird concepts. But here, rather than it being the first generation stuff where, okay, well, how do we set up these different factions of monsters near each other who maybe you can mess around with one to help the other, or which, say, for instance, Palace of the Vampire Queen or Keep on the Borderlands does well. Or again, let's say, how do we explore, in general, the base assault, which is what happens in the Against the Giants series. How do we talk about the Underdark? That's the Drow series. Here, those first questions have been answered, but instead there's a question like, what other ways are there to twist these things? And here, what he does is just throw in rare monsters. There's a measle. There is a raptor with froggy traits. There were spiders. And the fact that the moral, I guess, the moral implications of how you try to sort things out are non-trivial. The fact that there are these spider folk kind of can be helped. They're not necessarily bad, but the way that things are developing, the way this artifact is creating a problem, which connects to White Plume Mountain, amongst other things, is creating an increasingly volatile situation, which the players could also have go very wrong. They need to deal with this meteor, but then if they succeed, then some things are good that'll happen, but they may well have screwed up their own opportunities to leave, or they may well have hurt people they didn't want to hurt. And if they fail, things get worse and worse. And of course, that gives, and he's very clear about this, he offers options for this, ways that this can influence the campaign going forward. And I think that's all stuff which makes a very good starting campaign. Players won't be used to those ideas. Even now, I do not think most D&D players going into that will think spider people, evil meteor elements, famous artifacts in the hands of were spiders, and consequences. It's a funny thing, but so many modules do not, and N1 against the cult of the reptile god is good for doing this. But lots of modules don't map out the consequences of player action and how it might develop, and Cordell is regularly good at that, and that is a good example of it. The Sehurigan Trilogy. There's two, the other one is down there, in fact. The Sehurigan Trilogy, this is, though possibly, I think it might have come after his Illithid trilogy. I will talk about it before that. He did 2 trilogies for the Monstrous Arcana series. There were 3 of these. There was the Beholder trilogy, Sehurigan trilogy, Illithid trilogy, and they were each connected to a source book. And Cordell wrote the Illithiad. And so he puts lots of lore in there. These ones, the Sehurigan books, are also meant to connect him with DMGR 7 or DMGR 9, whichever it is, of Ships in the Sea, which is the nautical supplement for DMs, for all supplement. And these are nautical books. These are underwater adventures on the whole. 2 of them are very much underwater. 1 is on the water. And I think that alone should make our ears prick up. Why is there a trilogy of underwater adventures? Those things are hard to run. No one likes running that stuff. But in fact, I think they're really successful. They're really interesting. And there's some interesting stuff, like he just decides to give summary rules for underwater combat and underwater movement per Ships of the Sea, so that you don't have to buy the book. But more or less, the theory is, the basic principle is, there is an object the Sehurigan want. I have reviewed Eviltide, by the way, on the channel. There's an object the Sehurigan want, and they're going to try to get it. And the PCs first deal with them on land, and then, you know, these militaristic, well-organised Sehurigan, they deal with raiders, and then they have to go and find the raiders underwater with the help of a water wizard who can give them tech, basically, and spells, and then they have to deal with them there. That's how Eviltide starts. It's more or less what's going on in Sea of Blood as well, the big, chunky finale. But what's interesting is the way in which Cordell introduces players to these new concepts and executes them. Like I said, he's very good at execution, even if there are some issues around writing length. And here, the execution is that you learn these who are going to quite dangerous on land. They've got a couple of attacks, but underwater they have 4 attacks, and suddenly the knockout poison on their tridents is all the more dangerous, because, you know, you're already relying on tech to swim and get places. You are in their element and things are bad. And things get weirder and weirder. In terms of Eviltide, he's again great at escalation. And maybe this is another thing. How many great adventure writers who really finish execution of escalation well? And by that I mean, you start from a small thing and it gets bigger and bigger and weirder and weirder. Gaze at Firestorm Peak. Oh, we're going into a mountain because we're adventurous. Oh, there's a Duergar city. That's interesting. Oh, there's radioactive caverns. Oh, wait, there's a portal to the Lovecraftian realm. Or again, Shattered Circle. We're low-level adventurers. Oh, let's go into some caves to find things that are eating sheep. Oh, they're were-spiders. They're spiders. That's weird. Oh, there's some weird magic going on here. Oh, wow, there's a were-spider being influenced by an evil meteorite lump. And the idea of escalation where the punchline really is there. And I think the Sehurigan Trilogy is good at that. That in each part things get weirder and weirder. Again, the body horror elements are strong here. The kind of coils of things that look like wasps' nests caught on top of each other, but it turns out they're in a shark skin and they jump at you and they're trying to burrow into your spine. Not great experience, is it? The body horror is strong here, particularly in the second part, which is called... I don't know. I'm running this adventure at the moment. Night of the Shark. It starts on a ghost ship. It's a successful ghost ship adventure. He decides ghost ships sound fun. They're not necessarily lame. That's one thing. He doesn't have an imaginative horizon which is limited by what is assumed to succeed. So here, underwater adventures, yeah, they're great. Yeah, what happens if we give really simple rules to measure movement rates? You need magic really to function well. Because you're a surface dweller. Sea of Fallen Stars, by the way, which introduces underwater ancestries, is a really interesting companion. Intentionally, it's also a companion of Ships in the Sea. It's a setting book. Eviltide has this thing where you go down into the caverns and eventually meet four-armed Sehurigan Baron, who is in a hot chamber which is only accessible via the ruins of this underwater civilization. Through a whale gut they're using as an insulated tunnel because the volcanic vent has surrounded it beyond that. There's all kinds of really crazy weird stuff in that. Then there's a ghost ship. Then there's a dark temple to basically something that's not a god but they think is a god. Then in Sea of Blood you just end up going to their Sehurigan city, and then finally it turns out the Sehurigan don't want this artifact, or at least if they do, it's not only for Sehurigan related reasons. It's because an ancient dark race of underwater dwellers is up to no good, as you might imagine. The escalation is good, and there's so many things. Sea of Blood just gives so many options about, like, hey, you infiltrate the city, you're slaves in the city, these are the options when you're there, these are the factions when you're there, these are the major risks. Cordell never says this is how you could give your players a break, and there are occasionally things about kind of, oh, well, it depends if you want to get them to this level, or maybe this happens, or maybe this Deus Ex comes in. But he never says this is how to give your players a break, which by second edition is a thing you regularly hit. It's much worse now, but by second edition it is a thing you hit. And Cordell doesn't care. He doesn't care if your characters have to kill each other in an arena fight. He doesn't care if something burrows into their spine and destroys them. And it's second edition. No, you don't have just loads of spells to do stuff with at 5th level. No, don't be stupid. Your character's dead. Make a new one. He's ruthless, but in a way where the stakes are open and exciting. His second trilogy, accompanying his own book, is probably the more interesting again one than that, at least in terms of the conceptual density. The first one, which I don't own physically, is called Darkness Gathering, and I'm not sure. It's one of his weaker adventures. It has an interesting concept. The sun is going out more or less, and you have to investigate some weird things going on in a city you're associated with. Investigative adventures are possible and good. It's good. It's Cordellian that he decided to take a less popular genre or subgenre of adventure and do it. It's not as successful, I think it's fair to say. Masters of Eternal Night, though, the sequel, the second one, is a bit more interesting. Partly it just has great images and vignettes, like illithids wearing furs, riding sleighs pulled by, whatever is it, reindeer possibly, around a snowy landscape as you're trying to go through archaeological digs to find a dark artifact or something. It's not really clear what. And there being all kinds of weird things, because basically an illithid spacecraft has crashed here, and then you're like, are these things connected? The weird stuff we found out in the city about their plots to take over places, and now the fact they're trying to find bits of what the players will begin to be like, wait a second, this sounds weird. It's really interesting. It's probably not as interesting in terms of its it is interesting. It's maybe not as top tier in its final execution as Night of the Shark, which is its parallel in the trilogies. But it is distinctive, and it makes illithids not just something that sits. And I'm thinking about the great appearance in is it in D2 or D3? An illithid just hanging out in a cave. Yeah, that's great. There's a certain kind of je ne sais quoi, a certain classic feel to that. But nonetheless, it becomes stale. Eventually, you players will resonate with that classic image that they know now because it's in the genre. But the spin, the twist is they're riding sleighs. They're taking over a city, and that's interesting. The third book, however, in this, Dawn of the Overmind, this is, again, it's a bigger one, like Sea of Blood. This is really the one. These, by the way, these have terrible, like really badly written Knights of the Dinner Table adverts for RPGA. And I don't know if Knights of the Dinner Table is always that bad, but it doesn't make me want to join the RPGA, if you know what I mean. Here, the product quality, by the way, of these is often just really nice, clear, colourful maps. Dawn of the Overmind is perhaps his second best work. It's hard to say. I think the Sehurigan stuff at times really does hit somewhere near the same level. Some people love Die Vecna Die. I'm not as much of a fan, but some people say no, the sheer epic scope of that is up there. Shattered Circle maybe has a claim to being his second best, in the sense it does an interesting small scale but weird starter adventure. But Dawn of the Overmind, I think, is probably the second best adventure. And the reason why is because the description is, oh, you find this archaeological thing, you're on a spacecraft, you end up flying to a ring world. It's an enormous ring world, but the pre-programmed thing takes you down in a place where you think you're meant to be. You go around and do a wilderness adventure. Oh, that's interesting, a wilderness adventure on a ring world. Oh, yeah, you go down a shaft. You're underground. There's, is it Morlocks or whatever? in this thing, you're going down into the substratum, through the tunnels, through the things. You're finding, you end up realising the person who's been manipulating events, who is connected incidentally to other of Cordell's works, is the weird kind of ghost remnant of an ex-god of the Illithids. Okay, that's strange. You end up fighting some weird thing, so, you know, because he's told you to. That you then find that after fighting this weird thing, the real bad thing that's going on, I mean, you've begun to have suspicions by now perhaps, but is that the Illithids have come up with a multiversal device so that they can find a parallel universe where the Illithid Empire won, survived and conquered the universe, and that's why they've made a cover around this sun so they can get energy for their multiversal device. Oh, great. And then, yeah, then you've got to deal with that. And if you don't deal with it, well, maybe you now live in the Illithid Empire parallel universe. You live in the Year of Hell. Maybe you have some other twist going on that you end up being in some pocket universe. He does, and again, this is, I've already mentioned this, but this is such a strong element of his play that he is just willing to say, well, what if you lose? One thing I haven't mentioned is he's great at weird artifacts, weird things going on. Like in the Sehurigan Trilogy, he just has stuff like, on the note of White Plume Mountain, he brings in White Plume Mountain things twice actually. In Shattered Circle, he brings in a fragment of his return to White Plume Mountain mega artifact, which is the fourth of the three great items. And here he adds in Surge, which is a brother to Wave. But yeah, Elasmo Brancuvor, this disgusting oil-rich liver of shark mixture mixed with kind of kelp, which heals you and makes you breathe underwater and is really good for Sehurigan, but which is disgusting for surface dwellers. That's just a really interesting small item that is thematic and rich. Ilsen Nine's Ring, the Staff of Ancient Penumbra, Vibrissa Gauntlet, the Annulus, the Bone Thriven of Mastery. You know that someone who's coming up with names that metal has something to offer, right? He's good at that. But I was saying, yes, the consequences. Here, yeah, let's find the denouement. He has 3 pages of denouement. He's interested in giving players and DM a satisfying end to a campaign. He gives an alternate route to success. Then the worst case scenario, if every hope comes to naught and the character simply cannot stop the Illithids, things seem grim. And then he gives 4 options. Roll up new characters, some of Strom Wakeman's or other agents, and roll up temporary new characters and try to finish the job. You know, give them a roguelike life. That's interesting. Though they personally failed, their disruption proved just enough for another faction to do something, which is a cheat, but it does finish with, a Githyanki-ridden dragon of excessive size quickly melts the globe of the engine consummate away from the ring. The black sphere quickly falls into the ether gap, followed by the destabilised overmind. The universe is saved, and light returns to those stars that were being drained. It's a cheat, but it's an epic cheat. I wouldn't go for that one. The Illithids were wrong no matter how much energy. Yeah, that's bad. Just, it wasn't real. The final one, though, the Illithids were right, and he gives the most detail on this. The multiverse is changed, except for the Overmind ring. So the PCs know. They are the last hope of the universe. That is such a good ending. Don't you want your players to lose now for their own sake so they can become the last great hope? I think that there are so many things going on that with the sheer number of kind of types of adventure layered over each other, the extra concepts put in, the weird artifacts, the strange reveals, that it has to count. When you get these kinds of top 10 or top 100 adventures, well, I'm thinking, was it top 10 adventures was the one that Wizards did? You're like, how do you not get that adventure in? How do you end up with all kinds of weird knockoff rubbish from later eras, from 3rd edition or kind of inferior 2nd edition stuff, and not get the one where there's an Illithid ring world being built around a sun so that they can, or a ring world with a sun draining device to change the multiverse, and you can lose. Why don't you go for that one? But his greatest work, and I think this is pretty much undeniable, I don't think many people say anything else is preferable, is, I don't have a lid for it, but Return to the Tomb of Horrors. Return to the Tomb of Horrors. Hey, do you want a textbook? Did you ever think that one Tomb of Horrors wasn't enough? have you thought about doing 3? That is the conceit of this. Basically, weird stuff's happening. Some people who went to the Tomb of Horrors, I think that you pick up some artifact stuff with them, some knowledge from them, and because bad things are happening again. And it becomes clear that things were not quite set to rest. That is basically it. And so you do a investigative section. That is probably the weakest section. There are interesting things. I like the old adventurers. I think one of whom can join you, possibly 2 of whom. The ones who aren't dead. But, you know, they want to save themselves more or less. So, as well as, you know, some of them are good. They want to deal with the old problem that they didn't solve. You then go to a necromancer's academy in a swamp, which is shaped like a skull. The map is a skull. These guys are bad guys. I just don't, you know, I wouldn't trust anyone who did that personally. If you built somewhere shaped like a human skull, with internal skull shapes as well. Very, very dubious. So you go to Skull City and the Black Academy, and then you have to deal with that kind of 2 layers of Tomb of Horrors-esque stuff. And then you get to do Tomb of Horrors, with some shifts and some changes. You know, this is post the original Adventurers. This is my copy of Tomb of Horrors. I don't own an early printing because they're relatively expensive, not always, but relatively. And I was like, well, if I just get it with return, I don't need it. It is a facsimile of the 1978 printing. Yeah, so yeah, that's fun in itself. That's not Bruce Cordell, of course, but the ambition to say, oh yeah, you'll go and do some investigating, then you'll kind of go through a Tomb of Horrors-esque thing, then you'll do the Tomb of Horrors. Now, you think, is that enough? No, because in fact, the main juice here, in fact, if you count the Fortress of Conclusion, 2/3 of this book, is your 3rd Tomb of Horrors, which is Moyle, the city that waits, and Acererak's Fortress of Conclusion therein. There are some... Moyle, I think, is perhaps his best dungeon or environment accomplishment. I think Shattered Circle is really interesting. I think Gates of Firestorm Peak, from a dungeon design, environment design perspective, as opposed to conceptual design, Gates of Firestorm Peak is really interesting. Some of his other adventures, the dungeons are good or solid, but it's more the concepts he manages to stuff in. He is good at kind of filling space. But Moyle is a really interesting thing in and of itself, because it is a set of skyscrapers in a kind of almost Escheria, you know, MC Escher-like design, where you're not sure what's up and down, over a void. It's an ancient city dragged out of time and space to be a sort of part of the protections and puzzle for Acererak's final layer. And yeah, there's a map there of the towers. You can see that it's not incredibly complex, but it's interesting. There's a few routes around. There is looping, as we say. And then the different towers have different maps going on in them, different puzzles. There's all kinds of interesting vignettes in them, like the journals of past adventurers and people who might help you, and just weird bad things, as well as just monsters who are hard to kill. And then finally you get to the Fortress of Conclusion and have to go through the last few ringers. There is actually... The Fortress of Conclusion is possibly... I say maybe the investigative section is the least interesting. I think it's interesting. The Fortress of Conclusion is almost a jewel box. That's the size of the map. It's almost a jewel box dungeon, and in a way, compared to Tomb of Horrors, compared to, say, the 5th edition Tomb of Annihilation, which is a genuinely interesting dungeon, you know, I think maybe... I say that Tomb of Horrors isn't massive. It's maybe a similar size to the original Tomb of Horrors, much smaller than Tomb of Annihilation. I think, yeah, the big centrepiece, Moyle, the City That Waits, is this excellent visual idea, this excellent conceptual idea, with just stuff stuck in, you know, like new types of undead, weird artifacts, tricks for getting between places, executing that slightly surrealist and on the edge of reality thing, which he does all through his work, one last time. And of course, you could argue that Die Vecna Die is therefore almost the interestingly, this continues forward. You know, you see Sunless Citadel, weird vampire tree, keeping the Shadowfell. They're opening a gate to Orcus. There's a similar thing in his later work. But Die Vecna Die, you could see as the final capstone on that of what happens if Vecna, undead god of secrets is mucking about with the multiverse and crazy stuff's happening all over the place and you have to mash everything together. Even if I'm not sure it's always successful, I think it's a concept on the same level as that. But the idea, those two ideas, Dawn of the Overmind, the Ring World, going down to the multiversal device, the execution of that is great. And the Tomb of Horrors, Moral, the City That Waits, those are the apogee for me of Cordell's work. And so, as I say, there's massive range there from low level to high level. Return of the Tomb of Horrors is genuine high level, as in it's genuine level 12 plus kind of stuff. I think it's the intensity of quality is really there. And by that I mean there are some issues, but the sheer creativity, the sheer number of ideas, and the fact that just you can run them. I have run many of these adventures, or parts of them at least, where I've stolen bits, and they work. There are, you have to maybe put a bit more work in than you do in terms of parsing the text because of the era, but they work, and all the stuff that's in them just pops off the page and players love it. And what does he bring? Well, he's really the one who popularises the far realm, the Lovecraftian element. If that's what you're into in modern D&D, if you like some of the material for that, if that is something you want to put in your games, here's a guy to go to, and he's important historically for helping popularise that within the genre. I think he's also very good as an example in terms of, originality is the wrong term, but in terms of advancing the tradition. I think he's really good at the idea that throwing one more idea against the wall very rarely hurts. And that's something which, as a contrast to the thinness of many modules from first and basic all the way up to fifth and Pathfinder and everything else, the sheer thinness of something where you're reading a book and there's like one idea in it that's good. It's 32 pages, one idea. For Cordell, it's 32 pages and it's like 10 ideas. There's 10 things you want to steal. Even if you don't like the adventure, you're like, man, that's interesting. I think that's he is maybe the best exemplar of the throwing stuff at the wall school of adventure design, which is the best one. Anyway, that is a kind of overview. Hopefully, if you are thinking about running stuff, if you're interested in where to go and read, that's giving you some ideas of what to read. What Cordell adventures do you like? What ones don't you like? What is your kind of takeaway on his career? Tell me in the comments, and I'll continue next time. I've got to think about it. Someone like Ed Greenwood might be interesting. Someone like Anthony Husso or who else? Yeah, maybe you could come up with some ideas. I can think of a few in my head. I've written about great designers, but yeah, maybe you could suggest some, and I'll shortlist them and then I'll decide from there. Tell me in the comments. Till next time.